ACES Connection. We are delighted to have you join us. Next slide. It has been a difficult 2 weeks with the shootings in Gilroy, California, El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio. We must be mindful, though, every day that in the US there are shootings. Some 100 people a day die from gunshot wounds, and every one of these incidents and other incidents of violence are traumatic and devastating to individuals, families, communities, our nation. ACES Connection exists to help prevent and heal trauma, to help communities build resilience by coming together to learn about the impact of trauma, toxic stress on developing brains, and the lifetime health consequences of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and ways we can work across sectors to realize our mission of living in a world where all people thrive. Elaine and I love the way ACES Connection and the Trauma Resources Institute work together. A case in point is Elaine's doing pop-up webinars after Hurricane Florence, where I now live in Wilmington, North Carolina, and where now there are some 600 people who have taken the Community Resilience Model training. And then she did another pop-up webinar in Florida after the Panhandle was devastated by Hurricane Michael. So again, thank you. Today our speaker is Elaine Miller-Karas. She is the Executive Director of the Trauma Resource Institute. I am Carey Sipp. I'm the Southeastern Community Facilitator for ACES Connection. Our producers are Allison Sabula, Project Coordinator for ACES Connection, and Ingrid Cochran, the Midwest Community Facilitator for ACES Connection. We invite you, when you visit ACES Connection, to please take a look at the Communities tab and find and join your community. If there's not already an ACES initiative in your community, we invite you to consider joining others to start one. Next slide. ACES Connection is the digital and human catalyst that grows and supports the worldwide ACES movement and tells its authentic stories. At the end of this webinar, we'll share information about connecting with ACES Connection community facilitators in your region, as well as information about how to connect with the Trauma Resources Institute to bring the Community Resiliency Model to your community. For now, just to do a few housekeeping rules, there's no need to raise your hand. Just use the Q&A icon for questions. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, though there is a Q&A section of this presentation. This session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing, and we hope you'll share it with your friends. And any questions or concerns not addressed during this webinar will be answered via acesconnection.com. Next slide. So again, as I said, ACES Connection is a social network that recognizes the impact of a wide variety of adverse childhood experiences, and we promote trauma-informed resiliency practices and policies in families, organizations, systems, and communities. Next slide. As I said, we are throughout the United States and worldwide, we have more than 35,000 members. Next slide. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Elaine Miller-Karas. She is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Trauma Resource Institute, and author of the book, Building Resiliency to Trauma, the Trauma and Resiliency Community Resiliency Models. Elaine is a licensed clinical social worker and a trauma therapist, and is a key developer of the Community Resiliency Model and the Trauma Resiliency Model. The goal of both models is to help create resiliency-informed and focused communities that share a common understanding of the impact of trauma and chronic stress on the nervous system, and how resiliency can be stored or increased using this skills-based approach. She is a recognized international speaker and author. She is a senior consultant to Emory University's C Learning Program. She is inspired and launched this program. This program was inspired and launched by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in New Delhi, India in 2019, where Elaine traveled recently in April. These models have been used in the aftermath of human-made and natural disasters globally. Elaine has taught the Community Resiliency Model, CRM, all over the world. Would you please welcome Elaine? Elaine, would you tell us what the community resilience model is and share with us how the community resilience model can help us with our children, families, and communities in these difficult times? Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Carey, for the lovely introduction. First of all, I want to thank ACES Connection and the team. We've been working behind the scenes to put this together, and so I want to just shout out my appreciation for that. When we first talked about this, it was before the events of last week, so we changed our focus a little bit. And I want you to know as we get started, we're going to give you the key concepts of the community resiliency model, and we're going to address some of the basic 3 skills. We're not going to be able, this is what Carey and I talked about yesterday as the appetizer. So we're going to give you an appetizer of the model. And as we give you this appetizer, you'll probably have questions. And so we really want to encourage you to ask us questions, and we have left time at the end to do so. So if we don't get to all the material that we have hoped to get to today, of course, this is going to be available for you to look at in your leisure and to take a look at the content. So let me start out by telling you a little bit about the Trauma Resource Institute that I was the co-founder of, and we started in 2006. And so basically what I want to share with you about that is that we have many shared visions, I think, with ACES Connection. And we love our partnership with them because, as you will see, that our vision is also to create resiliency-informed and trauma-informed individuals and communities. So the community resiliency model is an evidence-informed intervention and to help children, adolescents, adults, families, and communities in the aftermath of extremely stressful and traumatic events. So I want to give you a short little definition of trauma can be experienced as too much too fast, like the shootings, like earthquakes, for example, or too little for too long, or too little or too much for too long. And that can be racism, that can be child abuse, that can be food insecurity, immigration, poverty. So what we have learned as we've traveled around the world is that there are not enough mental health professionals to treat as many people that have experienced trauma or really very stressful events, because many people sometimes don't experience what's happening to them on the inside as trauma, but just it's stress. And that's why we use also the word toxic stress. But so what we do is with the community resiliency model, it can be delivered by natural leaders of communities. So I'm hoping that many of you are listening. That means lay persons, ministers, teachers, first responders, as well as mental health providers and medical practitioners. We have found that when we train a person to be a teacher, and many of you have heard this old adage which says we teach people how to fish. So if we go into disasters, like what happened in Wilmington when we did the webinar, the community resiliency model went in a few months later, not too long later, and we trained 30 people to be community resiliency model teachers. This is our model because your community understands the community better than I do. And so we encourage people to integrate the lens of the community resiliency model into their own cultural lens and to adapt it to how it would fit their community. If you go to the next slide, there is another thing that we feel pretty passionate about, and that's a perspective shift in all of society. And I think that the ACES Connection has been a leader in this, and that is conventional thinking says we need to punish behavior that is bad. What is wrong with you? But trauma-informed started asking the question, what happened to you? I mean, that is understanding what is happening with this behavior. Where did it come from? And this opened up a door for many of us to say, oh my gosh, that poor kid, he lived in a very brutal household when he was a kid. And that's why he acts this way in school. And then resiliency informed, and the slide's a little off, but it's about our compassion. What is right with you? What are your strengths? I've spoken to so many people around the world who've had difficult childhoods, who've lived with the daily effects of racism or homophobia. And I asked them, well, what helped you get through? I've heard the most amazing stories. So you will see with the community resiliency model, it's a strength-based perspective. So the next slide. And so we're trying, along with this perspective shift, is moving us away from there's something bad, that this is really about your biology versus mental weakness. So CRIM focuses on the biology of the human nervous system, which we'll talk more about, and that there are common reactions. I wish I would have taken a picture, whether I've been in Nepal or India, or whether I've been in the Philippines, or I've been in Haiti, or many parts of the United States, or we have a project in Belfast. We ask the same questions, and the common reactions after stressful and highly traumatic events are exactly the same. So that's why I'm saying, we certainly have tended to pathologize these things that are common. And that doesn't mean that we don't need help, but it's really important as we reduce shame to really think about how we bring forward that question, not only what happened to you, but what are your strengths? So this is what CRIM does. We help individuals learn, and this is one of the most fundamental parts, to read their nervous system and to return to their zone of well-being, called the resilient zone or the OK zone for kids. And we do this through using very simple wellness skills. I always love to say the little quote from a woman in the Philippines. She goes, well, thank you for reminding me what I already knew but had forgotten. So some of these things you're going to go, well, I know this, Elaine, this is simple. And someone says, Elaine, someone said to me recently, these skills are simple, but that doesn't mean they're easy. So next slide. So I wanted to also just kind of loop back to our connection with ACEs, because ACEs, I think, has been revolutionary. But I want to highlight that there's a physiological response that begins in childhood that has implications for the physical and mental health outcomes throughout a lifetime. And I'm going to underscore physical. So if what happens to us, say as children, it affects our physiology, then we not only need something in terms of how we think differently, but we need to start using the body as also a portal of healing. So the community resiliency model does that. It's not just the body, because we're interconnected beings, but when we use this portal, we open up a new window of understanding, and also, most importantly, how we can experience greater calm within ourselves after we have these kinds of events. So next slide. I want to talk a little bit about the research. And some of the research tells us that for some people after a traumatic event, they have an elevated heart rate, they have an elevated respiration rate. And when we have these levels of distress, they're normal initially, right? When something happens, we feel that surge in our body, adrenaline is released. But then for most of us, we'll go back to our baseline. But for some of us, we stay up there. And if we stay up there for too long, because we have cortisol, the stress hormone that's only meant for short action, being pumped in our body over time. So how do we help people that may be in this state? And some of you may be the people that I'm talking to right now. How can we help ourselves in very simple ways, calm ourselves down to get back into this resilient zone where we have more availability to our thinking brain, so that we can make better decisions about not only ourselves, but our families and our wider community. So next slide. So there are 6 skills of the community resiliency model. We're not going to be able to talk about every one, but we also have an app we'll talk about later that you could go to and learn more about the skills. So next slide. We have used these skills across cultures, and I think this is the most important thing. We all are wired in the same way. We have the same biology. Whether we live in Haiti or we live in parts of Africa or parts of the United States, when we ask those common reaction questions, people tell us the same things. So I think what I have seen as I've gone around the world is this is a model that brings us together in our common humanity, that we see our similarities rather than our differences. Next slide. So it also can be used across the lifespan. So how can it be used for a baby and an old person? Well, for a baby, we can help the mom, we can help the caregivers, the dad, the grandparents, aunties learn more about how to stabilize their nervous system, and then that helps their baby, because we're tuning forks for our children. And when we're talking about the distress that's happened in our communities, whether it's the distress from the terrorist attacks of recent, or we have, as Carey mentioned, 100, I think she mentioned this, but 100 deaths to gun violence every single day. So I know some of you deal with this on a chronic basis, and sometimes we don't pay enough attention to that. But there are ways that, even if that is our experience, how we can help ourselves. So next slide. So we've also learned that we can work with children and adults, that you don't have to be literate. We've worked in parts of the world where they can't read or write. Doesn't mean that they can't learn to calm themselves down because they live with their nervous system every day. Next slide. So we can also share the skills. And I was talking to Carey this morning about this, that one of our trainers sent me a video of someone she knows, and it was a 4-year-old teaching her 2-year-old brother how to calm herself down through what we call the help now strategies. And I thought, oh my gosh, a 4-year-old learns a skill for herself and she can teach her 2-year-old little baby brother. Imagine if all the children in the world were able to learn very simple skills to self regulate, how that might change our world. Next slide. So this is what I've been saying. Apply your resiliency mass for yourself so that we know that if you do this, this also impacts your children. And if we go to the next slide, which is one of my favorite pictures ever, children need to sense safety, to be able to socialize, to be able to have friends, participate in school and social activities. And for some children who may have wonderful parenting in the beginning, um, events like last week can knock them out of their resilient zone, and that can change the way they operate in the world. So it's really incumbent upon all of us as adults to help children return to their resilient zone and to help them do that by being very present adults, by being very present. It means, are we in our zone as we're interacting with them? And we also know we have our own fear. And there's much research that has been done that, what helps children after these kinds of events, and having a parent be in their zone and be in a way that they can help their children can be the best indicator of a child not having more debilitating symptoms. So next slide. So key concept one, and this is kind of the heart of the model. So it's very simple. And you may have heard of these kinds of concepts with other models because I think that other models have spoken similarly. So next slide is the resilient zone. And here it is. It's a wave. And if you're sitting there listening to me, and if you can see me, if you just make a wave in the air, it's not a straight line. If you go to the next slide, this gives you an idea of how you can be in any one day within the resilient zone. So it's not the happy zone. I really want to make that very clear to people. It's the zone when you can manage the challenges that you experience in life. And that's one little kid said to me, you mean I can be okay sad and okay mad and be in my resilient zone? Absolutely. Because you can still manage and not maybe say things that you regret later. But sadness and anger are part of being human. But there's a continuum. And so to know, if you just even look at these little images, it says excited, worried, happy, sad, tired, calm, scared, is that this is a part of being human. And we can have all these thoughts and feelings and reactions within the resilient zone and still show up as our best self. If we go to the next slide, you'll see what happens. Now notice the thunderbolt on the left side. So instead of this nice resilient zone, we can get stuck. We can be moved into the high zone or the low zone. So the high zone is we're edgy, we're irritable, don't talk to me. Sometimes we say things we regret. The low zone is you're disconnected. You don't feel like doing anything. I don't want to go to work. I don't want to go to school. I don't want to do anything. I'm just so sad. I can't get myself out of it. Being in the high or low zone happens to all of us. And I've asked this question all over the world. How many of us have ever been in the high zone, the low zone? Everybody raises their hand because this is the human condition. The problem happens if we get stuck. If we get stuck in the high zone or the low zone, we have a plethora of different mental health diagnoses that go along with that. Let's go to the next slide. So I wanted to show you this. This comes from the C Learning program that I've been one of the C consultants with, where the Community Resiliency Model is integrated into C Learning as Chapter 2. And I do have a resource about this at the end, and I hope you all click onto that resource because this is a way that you can further learn not only about the lumber and the key components of CRIM, but also about a wonderful program that teaches children how to cultivate their compassion and their ethics. But this was a project where the children mapped whether they were in or outside of their zone for a day. And if you look at that, children were saying there were times that they were bumped out, but many of them were in. But what I loved was the comment. You mean I wasn't the only one? It also reduces shame and gives us that connection between others that we may have felt like the other, that we say, oh my gosh, she gets bumped out of the zone too. Next slide. So when I talked about the common reactions, like the questions we have asked across the world, and I put in the stuck in the high zone and low zone and these emojis, but I'm not going to read everything on every slide, but basically there's 6 domains of human behavior we've asked about. How has your thinking changed? How have you changed physically? How have you changed spiritually? How have you changed emotionally? Have your relationships changed? Are there behavior changes that you've noticed in yourself or others after a highly stressful or traumatic event? And these are an amalgam of the different reactions we've heard all over the world. I'm not going to mention every single one because that will take a long time. But for thinking, forgetfulness, for decisions, having distorted thoughts, sometimes having suicidal or even homicidal thoughts, physical, numbness, physical pain, rapid heart rate, breathing problems, tight muscles, insomnia, stomach upset, trembling, spiritual, feeling hopeless, feeling a loss of faith or increased faith, emotional, and all the emotions of grief, sadness, shame, anxiety, relationships, angry at others all the time, isolated, children being overly clingy, regressive behaviors, and this is I think human beings will do almost anything to get back into that zone. And if they don't have something organic to do, that they may do things that are not good for us. So they may isolate. And these are not things that we're necessarily doing with intention, but it may be something that we do um, as a result and not even know why we're doing this. So it's very important that people know that some of these behaviors, which of course we don't want to reinforce, are something that happens as a result of um, life experience. And so when we look at that in this way, people can see, oh my gosh, this is true. And can this reduce the shame that people feel as a result of what's happened to them, but also maybe think about new roads of how to increase their resiliency so that they can reduce some of the impacts of what life experiences have brought to them. Next slide. So adversity is not destiny, which I think it should be. I want it tattooed over my chest sometimes because that's the part. As much as we talk about that, that we know that all over the world, I've seen people in the most dire straits tell me the answer to this simple question: what's helping you get through? They tell me their faith. They tell me it may be their community, maybe their neighbor, maybe someone who is unknown to them that helped pull them out of the rubble. It is just the most amazing thing. And when we get to the next slide, this is the importance of that mind-body connection. What we have done with CRIM is we have integrated what I call neuroscience nuggets. And I want all the neuroscientists to know I'm not a neuroscientist, but we've tried to pull out some of the neuroscience and make it simpler. So we know there's a greater complexity about the brain. I just want to say that straight out. But when I heard and started reading about neuroplasticity, the brain can change. That's what neuroplasticity means. This is the hope of our nervous system. It's one of the hopes of humanity because that means we don't have to be trapped by the traumas that can get stuck in the stress in our body, that we can change it with intention. Next slide. So, Carey.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Elaine. As you're talking, it makes me think about when I've been popped out of my zone, as we discussed. That's when I've probably made some of the bigger quote unquote mistakes in my life, either in the high zone or the low zone. But you mentioned neuroscience and touched on it, but I'd like to know a little bit more about the neuroscience of the community resilience model.
Okay, and I'm going to make this really short and I could go into much greater detail. So go to the next slide. So, next slide. So, we all have access to the language of our biology and a framework to help understand the human experience. And that doesn't mean that when we learn to sense our body that it's always easy, because for some of us who had trauma, it can actually be a little bit difficult initially because we may just feel numb all the time. But what we've learned is when you start to pay attention to those sensations of well-being, they will grow. And so if you go to the next slide, the model is based on what I call the elegant design of the human nervous system. It's based on laws of nature. You know, we all have seen beautiful sunsets. We've seen storms and sunny days and wherever we live on the planet. And so that is about the nature that happens outside of us, but there's also the nature of the inside. There's the nature of the best day of our life, or the nature of when we saw something that struck us and we felt a sense of well-being. So those senses of well-being are what we're trying to amplify. It's not that we don't pay attention to distress or suffering, but it's that we also know something else is true and giving an avenue to shift our attention to something. So that's number one. You've heard me talk about the nervous system. So it's, I mean, I was trained as a social worker, and I frankly didn't want to know anything about science. And now I love reading about this because I know that when each and every one of us out there learn to track and read our nervous system, that it can change us. If we go to the next slide, and also neuroscience we've already mentioned, but I wanted to just simply talk about the organizing principles of the brain. And what's the most important thing, and again, this is a very simplistic description, is when I heard that there was a survival brain and that we had a part of our brain called the amygdala that's located in our limbic area, and that we are designed for survival. And our bodies are designed to sound an alarm based on experience from past things that have happened to us that may have been life threatening to us, to say, take action. And that taking action doesn't revolve a lot of thinking. It revolves about fight, flight, maybe freeze, because maybe standing still will increase our chances of survival. But it's really important that we all understand that, because I've worked with so many people, like, for example, after the Las Vegas shooting, someone shared with me that they froze and they felt so bad because they saw other people helping other people. But that was an automatic response that happens without thinking. And oftentimes when people freeze, it's because they've had a whole load of trauma as children, and that's a natural response to threat. So that's why this information is very important. Next slide. When we talk about the amygdala, I want you to think about it as your threat appraiser. It's operating all the time. And so, for example, I live in California. If it started to shake right now, my body has an immediate reaction. I start to flee. I now actually try to cut that off and do the things they tell me to do to increase my chances of survival. But I know that that's automatic. And so now that I understand this, it also helps me to intercept sometimes the reactions when I'm not at threat, because that's what can be difficult for us when the trauma is over, is that sometimes this amygdala will keep sounding the alarm when it has reminders of this event. So if we go to the next slide, again, going back to the autonomic nervous system, those reminders may be my heart rate starts to beat fast. The reminders may be that all of a sudden I get tight muscles and I start to sweat, so that there is a sympathetic hyperarousal that goes along with the high zone. Well, the sympathetic nervous system is really important for us to prepare for action. We get, sometimes I was a little bit on the sympathetic side getting ready for today. I was excited and we were trying to figure out all the technology, and I was actively working on using some of the skills to stay in my zone and to cause this parasympathetic reaction, which I did very simply by feeling my hands on the table, which is a form of grounding that I do all the time, and I have a parasympathetic response. So I've practiced that many times, so that happens automatically to me because I'm not in danger. I just want to calm down a little bit. So when we are in a parasympathetic response, we take a deeper breath, our heart rate slows down, we may feel even some tingling in our system. We have these wonderful release sensations that can happen as our body is coming into a more restful place. So if we go to the next slide, this is these reminders. So the amygdala sends us reminders, and they're based on the multisensory experiences of the life event. And we just saw something, and I try to avoid some of the media now because it is very difficult to watch, but there was a sound of a backfire from a car in Times Square recently. And so all of a sudden that people heard that, and that pop, which is just a pop, was connected to, oh my gosh, it might be an active shooter. So you saw crowds in Times Square running, and it wasn't anything. So that's how the amygdala sounds an alarm. That's a perfect example. Some of us, as someone told me once,
I walk out my door and there's landmines everywhere because those external reminders of the bad things that have happened to me are popping out all over the place. It's hard to go to the grocery store because when sometimes they make an announcement, it causes me to start to shake because that announcement on the intercom is connected to something bad that happened to me. So if we can be so affected by these external reminders, which also, by the way, are internal, we can have an internal sensation that reminds us of something bad that's happened to us. And that internal sensation then can call a whole cascade of causing us to have what Dr. Bob Scare kind of describe this process of, it's really called implicit memory, as a memory capsule that pops. And then we're feeling it all in our body as it just happened. And this is so important. Those of you that could be listening from the parts of the world that recently had events, is that it's important for you to know this is a normal thing that happens, but it can derail us. And we can intercept what I call kind of like the hijacking of the nervous system to come back to our zone by learning to read our nervous system. So next slide.
So Elaine, I'm wondering, what I'm hearing from you is that if parents are calm, children are calm, and if parents are calm, they're less likely to create more adverse childhood experiences. But how is the community resilience model different from therapy? I've used some of those skills in therapy, but will you tell us a little bit more about the skills that you teach in the community resiliency model?
Okay, and so I just also want to say that I think that sometimes our children are stressed and they're like maybe having a tantrum. Staying on our resilient zone is going to help us deal with the tantrum more effectively. Children can still have reactions even if we're in a very calm state. But I think the calmer we are, that it can help us, of course, help that little child regulate his nervous system.
The mirror neurons.
Yes, the mirror neurons, that what we see also happens in our body. That's the way we're designed. So when we see the suffering of others, for example, we're designed to have a response within ourselves as if it's happening to ourselves, to take action. And that is the hallmark of empathy and compassion, isn't it? But it's also important because if we're sensing a sense of, well, and you and I were talking about this morning, because you said you had been to a community resiliency model teacher after teaching and after one of the resourcing, that everybody in the room was feeling so good. and so it's contagious. So even though they talk about stress contagion, there can also be resiliency contagion. Yeah. Really want to kind of underscore that. So next slide. And we'll get into the skills. There's 6 skills. We're going to briefly go through the basic 3 in Help Now. And there is a researcher at Emory University, I'm going to call her out, Lindy Grabby, that just finished the first randomized control trial. And she did a 3-hour CRIM teaching, and she found that after a year, there was an 80% increase in well-being with people that learn these skills compared to the control group. So we are very excited about that. It's not published yet, but if you go to our website, we're always trying to put in the research that is building on our model. So next slide is tracking. Next slide. And that's reading the nervous system. So this is the foundation. And this is what I hope that you all leave with today, that if you aren't paying more attention to reading your nervous system, that you do, because what you pay attention to grows. And you can see there's a garden here, and many of people who've heard me speak before know that's one of my favorite metaphors, that we have gardens all over the world. And we also have weeds, and weeds are medicinal. Weeds can remind us of what happens to us. I'm not saying that to do weed eradication, because sometimes they're important that we pay attention to that. But what if we planted vegetables and flowers in our garden and we only watered the weeds? What would happen to our garden? The answer is pretty simple. The weeds would flourish and not the fruits and vegetables. And I use that as a metaphor to describe, I think that in the West especially, we have been so focused on saying the only way that we can heal from trauma or great stress is to talk about what happened. But what we've learned actually is that many people don't talk about it. And it doesn't mean they're avoidant. It means they know if they start to talk about it, it causes them distress. And that's one of the reasons why we have helped people to learn that when that distress happens, they can start tracking and move their nervous system and shift it into a state of well-being. Notice that change. And if they want to talk about it, and we say in our model, you can tell us as much or as little.
about it. Now, this is not about being a therapist. This is about being a human being. And I think what delineates this as not being therapy is that we're teaching wellness skills. The wellness skills has to have to do with, what makes you happy, what brings you joy, what makes you feel calmer. This is about the human condition, similar to how people teach mindfulness practice. So, and one of our trainers way back in the beginning in North Carolina once said to us that, that the community resiliency model is really democratization of mental health, because it's saying that it's in our hands, and that we need, we're fortunate enough in America to have a triage system of care, that if we at a community resiliency model training notice that someone's having a hard time, we would want to say, here's some mental health professionals that you may be able to go to. And we even have, as part of our training, how to recognize if someone's having trouble. And part of the requirement of becoming a teacher is knowing who the mental health professionals are in your community. But I think that what's so important for all of us to know is many people that need help would never, ever go to a therapist, but they would go to somebody in their family, in their community, their minister, their rabbi, to ask for assistance. So that's very important about the model. So if you go to the next slide, and this is important, is that when we learn to pay attention and know the difference between sensations of distress and well-being, for any of us who are listening who've had trauma in our life, then we have the choice of what we pay attention to on the inside. It's not easy. It can be like a magnetic pull in the beginning, but we can start paying attention to our well-being. And that's why I think in Lindy Graby's study, a year out, there was 80% improvement in well-being, because once you learn the skills, you don't stop using them for yourself if you really embrace the model. So next slide. And so this, people say, well, what is a sensation, Elaine? It's a physical experience in the body. And this was a study out of Finland. And actually I think they were showed a number of images that evoke different feelings. And then they were asked to color in a body, and the brighter colors were connected to more activation. And I'm just going to highlight those. Look at that: happiness, love, pride, anger. So every thought, feeling, belief has a corresponding sensation in the body. And the portal of sensation is what we've left out of the equation for many of us. When we start paying attention to it, then we can say, well, what are you noticing on the inside? Is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? So usually sensations of happiness are pleasant, but ones of anger are unpleasant. So then we can shift our attention to things that evoke a sense of well-being that could be evoked by what we're going to talk about in just a minute, which is a resource. So let's go to the next slide. This is my attempt at being a little bit more geeky about neuroscience. And it's important for all of you to know that you interocept every single day and you track. So if it's really hot outside, you're going to go into the shade. If it's really cold, you put in a coat. That is you. You have the ability to observe a body sensation and then take an action. And so research is beginning to show us, and some of this research is coming out of the UC San Diego from a Dr. Paulus, that body awareness can reduce impulsivity and promote emotion regulation and clear thinking. So the value and the attention to tracking may help each and every one of us be able to be calm when we need to be. And it's not going to take away, a response of needing to flee from danger. When we don't need to be that way, we can change. So next slide. So this is another little neuroscience nugget. Brain cells that fire together, wire together. What we pay attention to grows. So again, we put little metaphors around this neuroscience, and someone said, this is really an application that makes neuroscience simple and accessible and usable. Next slide. So tracking is foundational. I've already talked about this, so keep going. Next slide. These are some sensations of well-being. Deeper breath, slower or steady heart rate, relaxed muscles. Next slide is resourcing. And Carey's going to do a little demonstration with me right now, which I appreciate, Carey. So just go ahead and go to the next slide before I start asking Carey some questions. And so you can say, the best way to learn how to track your nervous system is by identifying a personal resource and then noticing what happens on the inside. So a resource, next slide.
can be a person, place, or thing, a memory, or part of yourself that makes you feel calmer, pleasant, peaceful, strong, resilient. So, next slide. It can be a beloved person. Next slide. Next slide. It can be real or imagined. Next. It can be internal or external. Next. As you can see, children praying, children playing. Next slide. So in order to really sense a resource, there's something called resource intensification, and Carey's going to help me right now in showing you how it may work. So Carey, can you tell me about one of your resources?
Sure thing. And I'm sorry if there's a little background noise. There's some construction across the street. So I'm going to resource to deal with that stress and to share with you how resourcing works. So in a stressful moment, I can remember last summer being on the Yellowstone River with my son. I was in a little kayak called a ducky because they wanted me to be safe and put me in this blow-up kayak instead of a kayak. And going down the river with him in front of me, turning around to watch me go through the rapids. And each time I made it through a rapid, I could tell he was proud of his old mother for doing that. And I felt a little stronger every time I did it. It was like I was building a muscle. Every rapid, I felt a little more secure, a little more capable. And so when I get nervous or afraid, and gosh knows, I wish I'd had this all my life to think about this, because these kind of tools, this is so handy. It's mental health in your hand. To go back to that moment of going down the river and knowing that there was someone ahead of me who was proud of what I was doing and how I was doing, and there were people I loved behind me also watching. So I was in the middle of this love sandwich on the river of and it brings me great joy to think about that, and I get to do it again real soon. So I'm excited about that.
I just pause you for a second. I noticed you even put your hand to your heart.
I did, and I know that's one of the skills as well.
It is. It's called gesturing. So what are you noticing on the inside right now as you told us about these wonderful resources?
Well, it's kind of like a baked Alaska. I have chills because it was such a memorable, even spiritual event for me to be there. So I have chills, but I also have a warmth in my heart. So it's kind of a reversed baked Alaska. Um,
So
but it,
can you bring your attention to the warmth and what you're noticing on the inside?
yeah, it's just my breathing slows.
Yeah.
It feels as though my heart rate may be slowing. I can hear my voice dropping down.
And I can just even seeing you over I can see that your face looks calmer. It's almost like it looks like your face relaxed as you brought this up. Is that true or not?
It's true. And so, can this help prevent wrinkles? Well,
Maybe. That might be something, wouldn't it? Well, thank you, Carey, so much. We wanted to give you a short demonstration because this is really conversational resourcing. And I see that we want to make time for the questions. And so if we can just go next slide. Yeah. These are just things to think about when you're working with your children, that sometimes coloring and asking them questions like this. For example, who's your favorite friend? What's your favorite activity? The next slide. You can create boxes of resources, and children can take that between, mom and dad's house if, mom and dad don't live together any longer, or take it to grandma's, or even some kids create them at schools and they get to bring them home. Next slide. So here's conversational resourcing, and that means doesn't have to be. It's a conversation between two people. And go to the next slide. There's just two that I want to highlight right now, especially after the last week. Is if someone has died, these are questions that we ask people that have to do with a focus of bringing that beloved person. They haven't stopped being a resource. Can you tell me some of your meaningful memories? What did you like to do together? One of the questions that I've often asked is if they would have known that you survived and they didn't, what would they have said to you? And oh my gosh, people have told me the most beautiful things. Next slide. these are also additional questions about resourcing after a crisis. And that moment of survival, like tell me the moment that help arrived, who else survived, who helped you the most, who's helping you the most now. Tell me the moment that you had survived. And sometimes also not just asking about yourself, but people often do the most incredible generous acts, and that can also happen. And so highlighting those can be very important. So the next slide has to do with grounding, and I'm going to just bring your attention to our iChill app, because that will help you learn about grounding, but it's just about paying attention and being in the present moment, because then you're not thinking in the future, you're not thinking the past, you're right now. So I'm going to just ask you to go through the next 2 slides. Next slide. These are just people grounding, different positions. And then I think, Carey, this is back to you. Can't hear you.
Thank you.
Can't
Can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you now.
Okay, great. Thank you. We were thinking about some of the hard things people have been going through, and we do have some questions. People asking about suggestions regarding children that are traumatized, and what we could do about children traumatized at the border, and also with regard to that, there are communities at the border. How we are what brings the community into the community resiliency model?
Well, I think the very first thing would be to help people learn about self-regulation for themselves, because whatever we're also helpers, we also have great impact on ourselves. So to know when we are in our resilient zone and not. So that's number one. And number two, I think that, we have many things that we could do with children in the border if we had access. And one would be, we have a huge part of our training is just experiential exercises of how you bring this to children. There's different games that we help children learn to track through games. We also help children track through drawings. And we are, again, strength-based focus. So it's not even necessarily them talking about the trauma, but it's talking about what's helping them get through. It's more complicated than what I just said, but I think that there's a whole plethora of different tools that we've developed to help children after disaster. And also when the children are at the border, that is an ongoing disaster. What's hard about that, it's not over. Some disasters happen and then they're done. There's repercussions to it, like a hurricane or an earthquake, of course. But when you're, let's say you've left, my mother was from El Salvador, that's where she was born, and she immigrated to this country during World War II. People come to this country for many reasons. And when I know some of the things that happened in El Salvador and why people leave for darn good reasons, because their lives are in jeopardy there. So they've left something, and now they're separated from their children. Now the children are separated from their parents. That's ongoing stress, and it's really incumbent upon us. Some of the people that are at the border are going to get asylum and come and live in our country. And I think we need to have a social policy about how are we going to help children now and after, in terms of bringing these kinds of self-regulation skills. And, there's more than the community resiliency model. I just want people to know that there's many menu choices, like mindfulness, like different kinds of movements that help people restore balance. Like Tai Chi, for example, or different other kinds of exercises. So these need to be thought of right now, and we need to be thinking about it right now. So if anybody are working in border towns, I've sent people down there with information and with handouts to work at the different, like with Catholic Charities, and they've done little bits of it, but we haven't had a response that I would like to have along the border. So let us know if there's something we can help with.
And Elaine, we had talked about some other resources, and I think your next slide
the next slide, Allison. Right. So, go to the next slide, Allison. I'm going to have you go. Actually, I'm going to just have you go to the third slide in this series, not this one, the next one. Okay. Next one. Yeah. So this is Help Now. We have trained a lot of people in law enforcement, and they said, we want to say reset now. This model can be integrated in, it's been integrated into faith-based organizations. It's been integrated into
the Dalai Lama's program. It's been integrated into school programs, other models of intervention. But these are very simple. And what these do, if you're way out of your zone, you sometimes can't think about resourcing or tracking, but you can name 6 colors in the room. You can go for a walk and be mindful when you make a step and notice that you're here and now. You can count down from 20. You can touch furniture, or if you're outside, and feel the sensation of it. And that these are all things that can bring us back to the present moment. So Help Now is also on our app. If you go to the next slide, one more down. These are the resources that we have, and we're going to come back to that. I just want to go to the next because I want to tell you about because I also want to entertain some more questions. So this is the iChill app, and know that you see Help Now is in the corner. Now we have it in the corner because you may need it right away, and you just have to push that button, and it's my voice taking you through the Help Now strategies, and all the things we talked about are in this little app that you can practice the skills. Okay. So with that, Carey, I think we've done everything we were supposed to do. I want to take more questions. Is that correct?
Right. That's correct. And one of the questions is Dale has wondered, and I know you've talked about Catholic charities, mosques, imams, rabbis, but is there one model of faith that you think has contributed most to the community resilience model?
Well, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
Let me answer it this way. When the Trauma Resource Institute, when we go into a community, for example, we went to Nepal after the earthquake, and primarily people were Hindu, but they were also Buddhist and they were Christian. So I'll have a whole group of people who have different spiritual beliefs. So when I ask a question, and I've asked this question again, I've said it earlier, all over the world, I'm just wondering what's helping you get through. And I can remember people in Haiti saying, I got Jesus right here in my heart. They said it in Creole, right? They put their hand to their heart. They took a deep parasympathetic breath, because Jesus, as we know, for many people is what helps people get through their Christian beliefs. But when I was in China after the Sichuan earthquake and I asked the same question, I remember many people had effigies of the Buddha. And I'd say, what's helping you get through? They would touch their effigy and say, the teachings of Buddha are helping me get through. So regardless of what people's faith has been, when I bring in and integrate this aspect of the nervous system, their belief of what helps them sustain them is what comes through. Now, because I've been one of the creators of the model, I was raised in Christian faith, and I can say that my Christian upbringing informed me about many things. It informed me that treat others as you would treat yourself. And that guiding principle, I think, is what the community resiliency model is all about. And when I work with ACEs Connection and I see the integrity and generosity of the people that work there, that abiding rule of conduct and being is inherent in what we're doing. And so I can say that all faiths have informed me, but I work with people of all faiths, and I really acknowledge and respect all faiths, and I ask people what helps them get through hard times. And that has been one of the most important things for me as a human being to learn on the planet. And there's many roads to healing and to self-compassion, and the sacredness of people's faith is very important to everyone around the world, and it helps them through very difficult times.
And right now, Elaine, while there is so much about racism in the world, so much traumatization around racism, when you are training with a multicultural group of people, is it as though when you're talking about the physiology of stress and that this is a biological model, we're all the same underneath the skin, and that relief of shame that people feel to know that we all share these physiological responses to stress. How have you seen that melt?
Well, I think that what I've observed over the last few years is that that the issues around racism are more amplified. And we have actually just hired our first racial equity, diversity, and inclusion consultant. Her name is Reena Patel. And we are actually just finishing a whole module that people can choose to use or not when they become community resiliency model teachers, about how to talk about in our country the very difficult issues about racial equity, inclusion, and when we talk about words like privilege or advantage. And so what has been shared with me, which some of my best friends are people of color, and in my own personal family, we had every color on the block. My grandmother was very dark skinned, and I'm one of the lighter ones in the family, is that people of color are treated differently. I've seen it in my own personal experience of my family. And I think what's hard about what it is now, as one person shared with me during one of our trainings, is she said that every time she goes into a group of people, and this was an African American person, she said, I don't know who's for me or who's against me, but I can feel myself being jittery and being in my high zone. And she had a language to be able to describe this. And I felt so grateful and humbled that she shared this with me. And we talked about how paying attention to her nervous system when she felt safer. And I think we need to acknowledge that some people never feel safe. And right now, I think racism is so rabid that people don't feel safe. Many people don't feel safe. So that if you have a moment in your home, or when you're in church, or when you're in your synagogue, or you're in your mosque, and you feel a little bit safer, then that's the time to pay attention to your sensation, to give your nervous system a break, so that you're not always in that high zone, that we can only stay there so long before we go into that low zone. And then we have all the consequences of diagnoses of anxiety and depression, and trying to figure out how to get help so that we can feel better. So I see that that this is a very important topic. I think that somatic-based models of intervention and paying attention to your body when those things happen, but most importantly, that I know with all my friends of color, my own personal family, that there's so much strength that comes from diversity. And that, just like we said earlier, that it's not your destiny. And I think that we can shift that. So we can hopefully maybe reduce some of the impacts of health disparities that exist in our country. Just when we look at the differences between the infant mortality rate between our African American children and our white children. It's like almost triple the difference according to the CDC. I think it's like close to 12 children per 1,000 die among African Americans, where it's like 4.5 among white folks. So that needs to change. And I think that part of the change happens with creating an awareness that we can help ourselves get back into a place of well-being, which we know then affects our physical health and our mental health.
Right, and as we talked about before, part of ACE's science is we look at what happens with the physiological response of the body creating more cortisol and adrenaline, and that's what wears on us. We have a question from Alfonso, who asked about older people in chronic pain, and for them to have heightened adrenaline and cortisol is not a good thing. So how can they incorporate these skills, and how can we get this to physicians and patients, since pain is such a focal point?
Well, Alfonso, thank you for that question. We have partnerships right now with Loma Linda University. They have a number of community resiliency model teachers within their healthcare organization that include physicians, that they are on fire about getting this into their community because they've seen the benefit of it. So, and they're actually doing randomized controlled trials with sickle cell, part of their organization, where they have sickle cell support groups, but also Emory University through Lindy Grabby that I mentioned earlier. And we also recently have an oncologist from Emory who came out and became trained, and he's planning to integrate CRIM into the oncology department. But I have to leave with a little thing about my father-in-law, who is 105. Who's 105.
And he lives with you, right?
Well, he's lived with me up until a month ago because we couldn't care for him any longer. We couldn't move him. But he has very bad knees. And he would say to me, "Oh, Elaine, my knees are hurting me so badly." And I said, "Oh, Kenny, I'm so sorry about your knees. I wish there was something I can do for them." He had an injury like 90 years ago. in his knees, which has caused the distress right now. He's 105. But I would say, I said, but Kenny, you push that walker all over the house. So I know you've got such strong arms. Is that true? And then he would go like this, and he'd say, oh, he'd move his hands back and forth. He goes, I do have strong arms. And I go, well, what are your arms like right now? Can you feel that? He goes, yeah, I can sense that now. And then I said, well, what about your knees? Do they still feel as well? They're a little better. So what I'm giving you that example because we have worked a lot with people with chronic pain. In fact, I was invited, 3 times to the Wounded Warrior Chronic Pain Conference by Walter Reed and gave presentations about the Community Resiliency Model. It's not going to take away the pain completely, but it can volume it down so that people can have another tool besides maybe pain medications that they need in order to manage their pain. But because it's organic, there are many people that like to have this added to their toolbox of things that they can use for chronic pain because it does help them at times when it gets amped up. So
Right.
there you go.
Well, Elaine, we're just about to the end, but one question that has come up a couple of times, the benefit of having this in a community where naturally selected leaders, people kind of self-select as leaders, and you have people speaking the same language and knowing the same tools. Would you talk about that for just about 20 seconds about how that makes it a community model?
Okay. Well, because one person impacts another person and another person and another person. So what's happening in Wilmington is a perfect example. So you've told us that 600 people were trained. That means there's 600 people there. Maybe, let's say just a percentage of them are working on their well-being. There's research that's recently come out that said if 10% of people can strongly believe something, that it changes 90%. If you can get 10% of people within Wilmington to believe that wellness skills and getting into your resilience zone and being calmer can help the entire community, the other 90% will be impacted. So
Right.
that's exciting information for us all to know. So keep working on your resiliency skills. It's like a resiliency muscle, and you can work on it on your own in the quiet of your own home. And the more you do it, the stronger the muscle becomes.
Right. And I've seen it in schools, and I've seen school children calming each other down, pressing against a wall, and then the little kids see the big kids press against the wall, and they go press against the wall to release some stress. So now, Allison, will you put up some of the closing slides so we can show Elaine's resources again? Because the community resilience model can be taught anywhere. There are leaders who teach it, but it can also be taught via webinar, I believe. And then also, I'm going to once again invite listeners, and we ended up with I think about 170 or so listeners at one point, maybe 150, to join ACES Connection, join with us in this ACES movement. The community resilience model is certainly something that ties perfectly in with what we talk about with ACES science. So join your local community. Start one. We can help you access the community resilience model. Share this webinar when you receive it. It's going to be a link will be emailed to you. Then, if we've got Elaine's resources. You can find Elaine's resources as well on the iChill app on your phone. If you go to the App Store, and you can download for free the iChill app that will take you back to Elaine. So, Elaine, any closing notes? I just want to say again how thrilled I am to spend this time with you. I adore you and love working with you. We all at ACES Connection think the world of what you're doing to take mental health and resiliency into the world. So thank you again.
I just want to say one thing. I think our children are our present and our future. And I know that we can teach children these skills. And when they do, they have this resource for the rest of their life. And I do believe that we can ameliorate and reduce the impacts of adverse childhood experiences.
Absolutely.
So
and children.
Yes, share them. And then, the final quote that came from one of our CRIM teachers in South Africa, I think this is what Nelson Mandela meant by the Rainbow Nation.
Learning about how to stabilize the nervous system is equality and is beyond nations, culture, religion, and ethnicity. So those will be my last words.
It's a beautiful way to close this. Thank you so much, Elaine. I've loved spending this time with you. Thank you again to Allison Savula and to Ingrid Cochran for assisting, directing this webinar. Any more questions, please direct them to the email that you will receive from ACES Connection that will tell you how to get in touch with your community facilitator in your region. Thank you again, Elaine. And with that, we'll close.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.